مراحتهم تفلقلق سراوي تجراي مستنكر عود دميقو مدر سماء يبدل فدبلقلق أبلقلق تغل عنك دقفتهم حفاش تغل
Hi, everyone. Sorry for dashing away just for a second. I had to move rooms because my internet connection is not that good. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the National Liberation Roundtable series. This is session 2. It is great to see everybody here. This is hosted by ILPS, the International League of People's Struggles, with speakers from the Seattle Tacoma area. And we just really hope that you leave this session tonight with at least 1 or 2 practical lessons that you can apply in your region and to your organizing. Next slide. Anna, do you want to go? I can go. Okay, you go.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Rana Harb. My pronouns are she, her. I am a member of Palestiniat, and I'm also one of the MCs for tonight. Just to give a quick background on who and what Palestiniat is. So Palestiniat is a Seattle-based group. We are a grassroots feminist organization that organizes and seeks justice at the intersections of anti-colonialism and gender justice. I'll pass it to Allison.
Thanks, Rena. My name is Allison. I use they and she pronouns. I'm a core organizer with the Pacific Rim Solidarity Network, which is an organization of anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist China, Hong Kong, Taiwanese diaspora folks organizing here in Duwamish land. I am also a general member of Anakbayan Central, Seattle, and one of your MCs tonight. Next slide, please.
All right, so today we're just here together to learn about varying liberation struggles. So I'm gonna just go over some objectives and like the main aims of today's presentation. So the first one is to educate one another on different organizations' liberation struggles. And when I say this, I'm also meaning that we must remember that we are not free until everyone is free. So keeping this in the back of our minds as we engage in Seattle Tigray Network's presentation. The second one is to find the intersections of unity between each struggle and where we can continue to build lines of solidarity, to deepen and develop our anti-imperialist understandings of each struggle, and to learn how to contribute to the anti-imperialist movement from within the imperialist core of the US. So we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about what imperialism is, but how do we engage in anti-imperialism when we are a part of the empire? And then we can go to the next slide.
All right, so just a little housekeeping before we get started. First, for the agenda and flow of this evening, I'm so excited to be hearing tonight from the Seattle Tigray Network. We had some other folks who weren't able to join us. They're out in the world doing rad things, and hopefully we'll be able to see them in the future, in future National Liberation series. So we're so lucky tonight to get to do a deep dive. Our guests will do a short situationer tonight. Actually, no, we're changing things up a little bit. It'll be a little bit longer since we have more time. So they will kind of welcome us into understanding their struggle, current situation in great detail. And then that'll be followed by a discussion with questions and answers, questions coming from folks in attendance tonight. For those questions, we invite you to send the questions into the chat, and where folks will be collecting them. And then when we get to the discussion portion of the evening, Rana or I will be posing those questions to the presenters. If you're comfortable when you're sharing your question, you can also share your name, where you're from, and your organization if you feel that's applicable. And then finally, like I mentioned, there will, this is a multi-part series. After the session, please return for parts 3 and 4. We're so excited to continue hearing from other folks in the area who are fighting for national liberation in their own homelands. Yeah, so much to learn, so much to discuss, and we hope that you'll keep on joining us. All right, next slide.
Also, I misspoke earlier. I said Seattle Tigray Network. I meant Seattle Tigray Network. I just wanted to correct myself on that because it is important to make sure we are naming our comrades' organizations the right way. So what is ILPS? So as most of you know, ILPS stands for the International League of People's Struggle. ILPS is a global alliance of over 350 organizations in over 40 countries. ILPS members organize and unite against the most specific enemy, US imperialism. They do it in order to create a large coalition to coordinate and build anti-imperialist struggles around the world. ILPS also follows a list of 17 concerns that are tied to fighting for the oppressed and advocating for human rights in civil, political, economic, and social and cultural ways.
Thank you so much. We'll be sharing social media handles for both ILPS Seattle Tacoma, as well as the other organizations mentioned tonight at the end of the presentation. So if you hear about any organizations that you're excited to get involved with, you can plug in then. So just keep an eye out for that. All right, next slide.
All right, so I'm going to do a very brief overview about what imperialism is. So ILPS defines imperialism in this context. So they define it as the most advanced and last stage of capitalism, it being the global economic, political, and cultural system of oppression and exploitation where the rich countries exploit poor countries for cheap labor and cheap resources in order to concentrate profit and to keep profit in the hands of very few and the ultra rich. And amongst those imperial powers, there is competition and rivalry for economic and political control of the entire world. I was just Googling, like, I know what imperialism is, but I just wanted to see what the interwebs had to say about it. And there was an actual really great visual that kind of helped me visualize it. So there was one head, and the head kind of had a bunch of tentacles that reached out to different countries where the head was the main control, and then it had all its hands in the different countries, economic, global, and political and cultural and social systems, and keeping control of that. And then when we're also thinking about imperialism, we're thinking about it in a US context. And since the US has become a highly industrialized nation, it became a global political and economic power of extending an empire outside of the US. And we see this in the Philippines, in Puerto Rico, and Guam, and those are just a few places that we see it. Next slide, please.
Yeah, thank you, Rena. I know exactly which illustration you're talking about. It is great. Love art for the Rev. All right, so if imperialism is the problem, what is a possible solution? We're here tonight to talk about national liberation, which we define as the revolutionary struggle to take the economic, political, and social control of a country out of the hands of a foreign power and establish the sovereignty of its people. When we say sovereignty, we mean self-determination. We mean power lives within the country, it lives within the hands of the people. National liberation is the common goal of many, many colonized peoples across the globe fighting against imperial powers. And when we connect those struggles, we are all the more powerful. Often the imperialist power in question is the US in particular. There are certainly other nations engaged in imperialism, but at least for tonight, we're kind of understanding the US as the most specific in the context that we're talking about. So today we'll get to see the commonalities between these national liberation struggles, although, like we said, there was a little change. So we'll be doing a deep dive today with Seattle Tigray Network. But across the series, we definitely get to see those connections. And then we'll also have the opportunity to discuss what ties various struggles together and what we can do here in the belly of the beast, here in our own very specific region, to work in solidarity and harness our collective power. Next slide, please. All right, so I can take this intro. The Seattle Tigray Network is a group of young Tigray who came together in November when overnight they were not able to communicate with their families. So again, this is very recent. This is really exciting and important organizing with a very contemporary context. For the last 9 months, they've been amplifying the voice of Tagaru in Seattle, as well as meeting with allies to educate and inform so they can be more effective in advocating for the voiceless Tigrayan people. And now we'll go ahead and just introduce those speakers. Thank you so much for being with us today. Next slide. Okay, I think I'm introducing them as well. All right, so the speakers that we have with us today, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to learn from y'all. Our first speaker is Nadia, a Washington State University alumni and an advocate against the ongoing Tigray genocide. And our second speaker is Rahel, a student currently advocating for the end of the Tigray genocide. Thank you so much. And with that, I will pass it off to y'all.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and get our slides up, and then while they're working on that, I do want to say thank you guys so much for hosting this event and giving us this space to really educate people on what's currently going on with our families, as well as the historical implications of what colonialism has done to Ethiopia and what European empire building in Africa has really done to all of our indigenous nations. I do want to give everybody a trigger warning because there's going to be a lot of information that is highly sensitive. We're talking about genocide, mass rape. A lot of the things that we're going to discuss are very triggering. So please just bear with us. And if you do need to take a break, we completely understand. We've been hearing about this for the last 9 months over time. So I can't imagine what it's like to just experience all of this in one day. So thank you again for being here. And with that, I will get started. So you can hit next slide. So the formation of modern Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a place in which the historical narrative has dominated more so than the history itself. It officially formulated in the scramble for Africa. The boundaries of Ethiopia include over 80 ethnicities. These 80 ethnicities or tribes have very distinct cultures and history, often interacting with each other. While we know that in the scramble for Africa, there were no Africans at that table, Ethiopia's on-again, off-again connections to Great Britain and its ties to Queen Victoria allowed for an Ethiopian emperor to consolidate power within its country and to rule over the various tribes in the late 19th century. A historical narrative was spun by the king of Ethiopia to paint a picture of a Christian nation surrounded by pagans and Muslim enemies to the Queen Victoria. Later, Emperor Menelik continued the use of this narrative in his relations with the same queen. These are the narratives which we will examine today to shed light on the colonization which occurred in Ethiopia. And then you'll notice those are just 3 different maps of Ethiopia, and there's a lot of geographical differences within the region. So it shows, I believe the first map has more of the nationalities, and then the last map has the contemporary Ethiopia today. So you can see that things are very different in terms of where those borders are, where they end, where they begin. There was a divide and conquer type of mentality, and you can kind of see that with the maps. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, today, Ethiopia has 80 different ethnic groups. Almost each ethnic group in Ethiopia has created a liberation front to assist them in their fight for sovereignty from Greater Ethiopia. One of the strongest narratives that many of you may have heard in the past is that Ethiopia was never colonized by any European country. It's the only country in Africa that's never been colonized. This, however, is because Ethiopia itself was the colonizing factor. Emperor Menelik consolidated power over the feudal kings that existed pre-19th century. These feudal societies that existed were along ethnic lines, and for the most part, people had control over their own territories. Naturally, there are changes in history to these lands and war between the ethnicities. Tigrayan history is the same. Tigray is the most northern region in Ethiopia. It has approximately 7 to 10 million people, and they make up 6% of the Ethiopian population. People of Tigrayan descent, however, can also be found in neighboring Eritrea. For the most part, all Tigrayan people do share the same ancient culture and history. The people of Tigray are descendants of the ancient Aksum Empire, an empire which at one point covered southern Yemen, reached as far as the Mali Empire, and used the port of Andulis for trade, which can now be found in modern-day Eritrea. There is a historical narrative that Tigrayan people are of mixed ancestry, African and Arab. However, modern historians have moved away from this narrative, as it may have been an attempt by kings and queens to appear more, quote, civilized during an era of African colonization. Tigrayans as a whole have more indigenous African roots than they do ties to Arabia. If there was ever unity in Ethiopia among the various tribes, it was when the various groups came together to fight off Italian colonization at the Battle of Adwa. However, this wasn't the harmonious moment that historians have described it as. The quote, King of Kings, Emperor Menelik, led the fight. However, he consolidated power in a brutal way. He conquered in the south of Ethiopia and bent the various ethnic groups in those areas to his will. He enslaved hundreds of people in the south in his conquest of the tribes of Ethiopia. In a letter to the Queen Victoria, he actually states the borders to her, and I can read this letter to you guys right now. He uses highly colonized language, and he uses slurs to describe certain groups, which I won't say out loud, but I'll kind of let you know that he's going to use a slur. So I'll begin now. Being desirous to make known to our friends the powers of Europe, the boundaries of Ethiopia, we have addressed also to you, your majesty, the present letter. These are the boundaries of Ethiopia. Starting from the Italian boundary of Arafel, which is situated on the sea, the line goes westwards over the plain Meda of Gegra towards Mahayo, Halai, Digsa, and Gura up to Adibaro. From Adibaro to the junction rivers of Marab and Aradat. From this point, the line runs southwards towards the junction of Atbara and Setet rivers, where there is situated in the town known as Tomat. From Tomat, the frontier embraces the province of Gederef up to Karkoj on the Blue Nile. From the Karkoj, the line passes the junction of the Sobat River with the White Nile. From thence, the frontier follows the river, Sobat, including the country of Arbor, insert slur, to refer to the Oromo people, and reaches Samburu. Towards the east are included with the frontier the country of the Borena, slur again, the Arusi country up into the limits of the Somalis, including the province of Ogaden. To the northwards, the line of the frontier includes Haber al-Wal, the Gada Bursi, the Isa Somalis, and reaches Ambos. Leaving Ambos, the line includes Lake Assal, the province of our agent vassal Mohammed Anafari, skirts the coast of the sea and rejoins RFL. And this is where he starts to use colonized language. While tracing the actual borders of my empire, I shall endeavor, if God gives me the life and strength, to reestablish the ancient frontiers of Ethiopia up to Khartoum and Lake Nazana with all the insert slur for Oromos. Ethiopia has been for 14 centuries a Christian island in a sea of pagans. If powers at a distance come forward to partition Africa between them, I do not intend to be an indifferent spectator. As the Almighty has protected Ethiopia up to this day, I have confidence he will continue to protect her and increase her borders in the future. I am certain he will not suffer her to be divided among other powers, meaning the Europeans. Formerly, the boundary of Ethiopia was the sea. Having lacked strength sufficient and having received no help from the Christian powers, our frontier on the sea coast fell to the powers of the Muslim man. In this case, he means Somalians. At present, we do not intend to regain our sea frontier by force, but we trust that the Christian power, guided by our Savior, will restore us to our sea coast line, at any rate, certain points on the coast. Formally, and that's the end of it. It was written in Addis Ababa in 14th Mazar 1883, which is in the European calendar, April 10th, 1891. So here we see in this letter that Emperor Menelik uses this narrative of a Christian nation surrounded by Muslims and pagans. Today, Ethiopia probably has a majority of Muslims. However, it still carries this narrative of a Christian nation surrounded by enemies. He repeatedly uses the word, which we have come to understand as a slur against the Oromo people. We can see that he uses this language of conquest to describe where Ethiopia borders should be, claiming it should reach the sea, which is present-day Somalia. He very clearly states that if powers that are not African intend to divide Africa, he will not stand idly by. While he was not present at the scramble for Africa, he advocated for greater Ethiopia protected by Christianity, which appealed to Christian colonizers. The impact of enslaving Muslims and African spiritual believers can be seen to this day, and we will go into this later in the presentation. In the north, so that was used to describe how Menelik conquered in the south of Ethiopia. And in the north, it was a divide and conquer strategy. So in the north, Menelik used the same divide and conquer strategy that European colonizers used. Menelik made treaties with Italy, which went against the king of the region, Johannes, and this treaty was titled the Treaty of Wichel. This agreement gave the most northern part of Ethiopia, which housed 9 different ethnicities, to Italy. This divided the Tigray region, making the new northern border between Ethiopia and colonized Eritrea. Those 9 ethnicities would later become modern Eritrea. Menelik enslaved, massacred, and sold off indigenous people to consolidate power and create the Ethiopia that the world knows today. It's important to understand that the basic construct of Ethiopia, regardless of how it's being ruled, is a nation composed of many indigenous nations with their own histories, practices, and cultures. Next slide, please. In the early 20th century, Ethiopia solidifies this narrative of a Christian nation chosen by God. We can see this in the global response to Haile Selassie's rule. Selassie was seen as a great leader to the world, but at home, he manufactured a famine in the north. He bombed Mekelle, the capital of Tigray, and in an era of colonialism, Ethiopia crowning a Black king was symbolic for Black liberation around the world. At home, Italy would again invade and this time be successful. For a brief period of time, Ethiopia would be under the rule of Italians, and Selassie was exiled, living in Europe, spending most of his time in Great Britain. Had Ethiopia not depicted itself as a well-educated Christian kingdom in Africa, Britain would not have aided so much. With the help of Great Britain, Selassie was restored as emperor, and he wrote the Constitution of Ethiopia, which limited the powers of parliament. As he believed, the person of the emperor is sacred, his dignity inviolable, and his power indisputable. Under Selassie's rule, Amharic supremacy was established in all of Ethiopia, including in non-Amharic lands. Amharic is a Semitic language that derives from the ancient language of Giz. Tigrinya also derives from Giz and is the closest language to its ancient origin. The Amharic language is a pidgin language derived from Tigrinya. It was the language of the monarchy. It was language in schools, work, and judicial systems. This level of disenfranchisement caused systemic issues for indigenous populations that did not speak Amharic or even understand the various Giz dialects. We do encourage people to learn more about what's happening to other minority groups and even majority ethnic groups, such as the Oromo, Ogaden, and Somal communities in Ethiopia. Imagine being an elder from a small tribe with no written language. The laws being written about your indigenous land didn't reflect the needs of your people or take into account the indigenous religious and cultural practices that the people were performing for centuries. This has resulted in a lot of practices dying out, or worse, being misunderstood and labeled barbaric, rather than appreciated for its unique characteristics. Some of these sentiments still exist today. While their native religions and spiritual practices were labeled as witchcraft, rumors circulated about practices there was no evidence for. Claims of cannibalism with zero evidence of such practices has led to targeted attacks on these minority groups. Next slide, please. Under Haile Selassie, education grew in the various regions, despite it being in Amharic. Elites in all regions had access to higher education, which had a domino effect of starting student-led revolutions. In 1974, Haile Selassie was overthrown by a student-led coalition that had the backing of the Soviet Union called the Derg. The corruption of the empire is what fueled these sentiments. Haile Selassie spent $35 million on his 80th birthday just 1 year before, in 1973, while hundreds of thousands died of drought. The Derg regime made many of these situations worse. Under the Derg, 2 million Ethiopians would die and famine would again come to Ethiopia. This would heavily affect the Tigray region. This time, the world would rally to donate and support the poor African country, not knowing this famine was intentional, not natural. Derg restricted the rights of various ethnic groups and continued to push Amharic supremacy. Since Menelik had sold the north of Ethiopia to Italians, there was always fighting between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Liberation fronts would begin to pop all over Ethiopia, including TPLF, which is the Tigray People's Liberation Front, EPLF, which is the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, and OLF, the Oromo Liberation Front. The famine created in the north was an intentional man-made famine to prevent the growth of liberation fronts, specifically in the Tigray region. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. On this slide, there's actually a very interesting map which shows all of the different liberation fronts that pop up in Ethiopia in the 80s. I want to say it's like the late 70s, early 80s. And you'll notice they are all over because the Amharic supremacy was very real for a lot of people, and people were literally starving while kings and queens were, being treated and given a lot of respect around the world and spending all of their money and getting resources. So, it's such a high level overview of everything that's going on, but there's a lot that goes into this. All right, next slide. So in 1983, Ethiopia would once again unite to defeat an enemy, this time the Soviet-backed Derg regime. They were led by the Tigrayan people. TPLF was formed by a group of 11 students. They held Marxist-Leninist views and sought to free all of Ethiopia from oppression. I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but those are that's an original document that they created themselves to talk about what their goals are, their social programs, their political programs, their policies. And we can see from this document that they supported Eritrean independence and wished to create an Ethiopia free from imperialism. They supported anti-colonial movements in Arab and African countries, as well as standing against Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. They wished to create a federal system in Ethiopia to own the means of production rather than a capitalist society with individual owners. In the sciences, they clearly stated they would study traditional medicines and develop a public health system for all regions. While they sought to create a utopia, the biggest setback was that Ethiopia, the empire, did not deserve to exist. Next slide, please. There were many challenges TPLF faced when they came to power. TPLF and EPLF would be united when fighting against the Derg. And Eritrean independence movement started in 1960, and Eritrean independence movements, which started in 1961, would finally become successful in 1991. TPLF and EPLF would soon become enemies when Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea rose to power, and that's the man in the middle there. He is a brutal dictator that rules Eritrea to this day. Many argue he rose to power by backstabbing his comrades in war and then arresting any and all opposition once he held power. They have not held elections since 1993. The people there are suffering, and we encourage people to learn more about the Eritrean Bright Future and Yaaka movements. Isaias spent 30 years convincing Eritrean people that Tagadu were the enemy, that TPLF was to blame for his ineptitude in governing a small country. Ethiopia and Eritrea fought a border war in 1998 to 2000, which has lasting implications until this day. The narrative spun by Isaias for 28 years would be the backbone on which his conscripted army, which includes children soldiers, would invade Tigray. Next slide, please. So really the core issue that is created by colonialism can't be, it can't be erased. You can't reform it. So within Ethiopia, TPLF created EPRDF, a coalition based on ethnic federalism. And this is a really cool map because it actually shows you all the different ethnic groups and where those regions generally are. There are disputes between different groups about where these borders exactly are. So this is kind of, I guess, the current agreement. Within TPLF, so each region in Ethiopia would lead themselves and have sovereignty in their own right. A new constitution was formed, which allowed the regions to practice their own languages, form their own government, and gave new respect to the local practices of different indigenous groups. However, EPRDF grew into an authoritative state. There were systemic issues with the organization because Ethiopia is a colonized state. Due to the divide and conquer strategy used to bring these tribes into Ethiopia, these tribes would always feel a sense of disillusionment with Ethiopia. The borders and territories that were colonized under Menelik should have been liberated from Ethiopia. There really isn't a scenario in which the various ethnic groups can be free from oppression if they weren't allowed to have their own independent states. Next slide, please. It's unfair to discuss the way EPRDF continued to oppress people without speaking about the gains in Ethiopia over the last 30 years. People in Ethiopia were able to use translators in court, local governments used their native language, and people learned their native tongue before learning Amharic. Ethiopia developed the fastest growing economy in Africa. More people in Ethiopia became educated under EPRDF. Indigenous groups in Ethiopia gained the freedom to practice their culture and religion. However, narratives of corruption in the government was used to spew hate for the Tigray people, a narrative which seeks to dehumanize the Tigaru people. Ethiopia has painted the entire ethnic group as thieving and greedy, claiming that they've stolen 30 billion in aid. The world supported new leadership in 2017 due to this narrative. Since then, attacks on Tigaru have grown all over Ethiopia. While we don't condone the authoritative regime EPRDF grew into, TPLF was born out of the Wayane or revolution for the Tigray people. Tigaru people went from agriculturists who were driven to the mountains by invaders to world leaders in a matter of 30 years. We honor their fight for our liberation from Amhara supremacy and continued attacks from Greater Ethiopia. We condemn any and all atrocities committed in their name. We also know that anytime Tigrayans were not in power, the federal government would again attack Tigray. Every Ethiopian leader has attacked Tigray as well as the other ethnicities. This tells us that Ethiopia itself is a country with various actors struggling for power while civilians die in the thousands. People claim Ethiopia saw 27 years of darkness under TPLF rule. Finfinne, or Addis Ababa as the Amharu renamed it, became one of the strongest capitals in Africa under their rule. Claims from Amharu about subjugation under TPLF are simply not true. While Muslim and pagan groups in Ethiopia did experience continued oppression under EPRDF's rule, the Amharu today cannot make this claim. Their territories grew under TPLF. Next slide, please. The TPLF-led EPRDF was in power until 2017. Meles Zenawi was Prime Minister of Ethiopia from 1995 until 2012. While Ethiopia saw gains under his leadership, there were also valid allegations of human rights abuses in 2005 and in 2009. These allegations are very real to the people that they affected. Later, these human rights abuses were used to justify attacking the regional state of Tigray. His passing in 2012 left a power vacuum, which right-wing authoritative elite were able to capitalize on. From 2012 to 2017, we see a growing hatred for TPLF. And if we were to take any issue with the hatred of a political party, it's that for many Ethiopians, TPLF and Tigray people are one and the same. Haile Mariam Desalegn took over when Meles Zenawi died. He stepped down from government after years of unrest in the Amhara and Oromo regions. Desalegn resigned and opened the seat to Abiy, a young politician who many thought would reform a corrupt government. Next slide, please. In Abiy's first 3 years as appointed prime minister, he released hundreds of political prisoners, made peace with neighboring Eritrea and Somalia, and won the Nobel Peace Prize. However, he closed important trade routes to Tigray, so food and supplies were limited in the region. He rearrested many of the prisoners he had originally released, and many theorized that he murdered Hanshalu Hundessa, an Oromo singer and activist who some say woke the people up from the oppression they faced in their daily lives. Locutus was and is spreading very badly in East Africa. In the Tigray region, agriculture makes up for more than 60% of the region's economy. When Locutus spread, there was no line of defense for your average farmer. COVID impacted us here in the United States in a surprising way for many. At home, COVID was one of the first weaponized events that Abiy Ahmed would use to attack Tigray. While all of Ethiopia received masks from the Ethiopian government, Tigray did not. This abandonment of Tigray was one of the many first calculated moves to make peace with Somalia. This abandonment of Tigray was one of the very first calculated moves, and making peace with Somalia and Eritrea allowed for the invasion of the Tigray people. So now Rahel is going to continue and talk to you about what has happened since September, really, when we were August, when we were supposed to have elections in all of Ethiopia. Thank you.
Hey everyone, can you hit next slide, please? Along with the abandonment of Tigray several months leading up to the war, the Ethiopian government had to ensure their position in power by postponing elections. Next slide. As mentioned, Abiy Ahmed was appointed to power in 2018 in hopes of reestablishing EPRDF and regaining some stability in the country. However, he was never elected by the people of Ethiopia. General elections were scheduled for August 29th, 2020. Abiy postponed elections due to COVID-19, along with neglecting Tigray during the pandemic by withholding all forms of COVID relief. Ethiopia has not imposed any strict COVID regulations and has been operating as normal since the start of the pandemic. No one wears masks. Coffee shops, restaurants, clubs throughout the capital of Addis Ababa have all been open and thriving. So it's beyond absurd that elections were being postponed due to COVID. It was clear that COVID was used as an excuse to illegally extend his time in power. TPLF found it unconstitutional, and the people of Tigray decided to hold the regional elections within their constitutional right. TPLF was threatened. Abiy warned TPLF that if Tigray carried out their elections, that he would impose conflict, and mothers would mourn and buildings would be destroyed, prefacing the genocide. Tigray voted that following month in September of 2020, and TPLF won the regional elections. As part of elections being held in Tigray, unelected PM Abiy labeled TPLF as an illegitimate party, and that they were elected unconditionally. The federal government began to withhold social welfare funds, refused to release a budget, confiscated locust fighting machinery, among other things. Next slide, please. On November 4th, 2020, the day the entire world was paying attention to the US elections, Abiy declared his law and order operation in response to the claim that TPLF attacked the northern military base. The claim was later proven false in May 2021 by the African Union, months into the genocide. This law and order operation was advertised as a quick and easy 72 hours to remove the elected regional governing party of Tigray, claiming that civilians were not the targets and this would be a short 3 days. However, that wasn't the case. Abiy imposed a telecommunication blackout across all of Tigray. He suspended the licenses of international media outlets like BBC and Reuters. At this point, no one had access to Tigray. Many Ethiopians and Eritreans were cheering on the operation and showing an abundant amount of support. On November 6th, Abiy announced that he will continue to launch airstrikes throughout Tigray. As the days went on, it became very clear that civilians were the target. The Prime Minister stated on November 22nd, 2020, that he will show, quote, no mercy to civilians who do not save themselves from TPLF. During the early weeks of November, Tigray was still in a communication blackout. And so we had zero access completely of what was happening on the ground. Our first glimpse was when refugees began fleeing by the thousands by foot to Sudan. Next slide, please. Thousands began fleeing by foot, days and days on end, crossing the Tzeki River, boarding Tigray and Sudan. Many were displaced throughout the journey. Thousands were scrabbling out of Tigray as they were being bombarded. Mothers lost their children. Their children walked alone due to their parents being killed. And as their journey, they're seeing dead bodies as they're fleeing. There's even a story of a woman who was pregnant with twins and gave birth on her mission, but didn't end up surviving and passed on her way to flee to Sudan. Currently, 70,000 have fled, but thousands and more would have fled. However, the Ethiopian government began blocking the border, so people were prevented from exiting Tigray. But the journey was beyond horrendous, but it did not compare to the horror that they were fleeing from in Tigray. Next slide. And then here, this video has testimonies from survivors when they were first fleeing to fleeing to Sudan, and what they experienced firsthand very early on into the war. You can play the video.
A civil war in Ethiopia has been fought in the shadows. The government's cut the phone lines and the internet switched off. But the blackout doesn't hold in neighboring Sudan. And here in the borderlands, a vicious conflict is revealed. There are no facilities in Hamdayet. There's nowhere to sleep, and there's not much to eat. But tens of thousands of Ethiopians have risked their lives to come here. They are Tigrayans from the state of Tigray, fleeing war and ethnic hatred. Was it a difficult journey to come here?
It was so difficult because we are hungry. We don't have any water, any food. We don't have any transportation.
Abedom and his wife Rachel walked for 10 days to get here.
There is sunlight.
It's hot.
Yeah, it's hot. There was so difficult. I don't know.
They have suffered and experienced great trauma. The refugees driven from their homes by bombing and shelling, often separated from family members in the chaos. Gabriel Fassah told me his son was shot by soldiers as they made their escape.
What's his name?
Fan.
How old?
Sami.
He was 12, killed, said his father, in a town called Adibai.
Who is that?
Many passed us pictures, like this man, now searching for his wife and 3 children.
I'm crazy. I'm going crazy. My mind is not working. How can my brain work?
This is my wife.
I suppose you must feel quite helpless right now.
My mind is completely muddled. I've looked everywhere and I don't know what to do.
A power struggle between the Ethiopian government and the leaders of Tigray state has triggered this conflict, and it is fueling deep-rooted ethnic tensions.
Town can cut for this in the head all now.
At the local clinic, we met a Tigrayan who said his neighbors tried to kill him by revealing his identity to fighters from another ethnic group.
They came with axes. They attacked me, then talked about whether they had killed me. One took a look and said, "He's alive." His friend said, "Well, finish him off."
Dr. Tedros Tafara was given the job of treating his wounds, and we watched his patient squirm in agony. Everyone found this difficult to witness.
What do injuries like this tell you about the conflict across the border?
Hatred, extreme hatred, insanity, absolute insanity. There is no rational, there is no real human reason to do things like that to a brother.
The village of Hamdayet has turned into a transit zone, and we watched as refugees boarded buses for a camp the Sudanese are still trying to build.
There are more than 1,000 refugees in this convoy who've been offered sanctuary by a country that cannot afford to care for them, and they'll be taken to a ramshackle spot 12 hours from here, last used in the 1980s for the victims of the Ethiopian famine.
Another crisis is building on the borderlands of Sudan, with the UN preparing for the arrival of 200,000 people, victims of a war now tearing Ethiopia apart. John Sparks, Sky News in Hamdayet.
So yeah, that was our first glimpse of seeing what was happening on the ground, because like I said, Tigray was in a communication blackout, and they cut off ties with media outlets, so no one really knew what was happening. It was expected that 200,000 were gonna flee to Sudan, but like I said, the Ethiopian government blocked that road, so people weren't able to flee. Next slide, please. Okay. As testimonies of refugees were flooding in, we in the diaspora began to gain some clarity of the current state of Tigray, what was really happening on the ground. Unlike how Abby stated that this was that he was only entering to target Tigray leaders, it was clear that civilians were getting caught in the crossfire. And as you heard in the refugees' personal testimonies, civilians were being massacred. There was nonstop airstrikes, especially in urban and populated areas, by government planes. Roads have been blocked, and shortage of essential supplies like fuel, food, water, and that's still current to this day. Banks were closed, leaving Tigrayans with no money. As reports began covering the conflict, Abiy was placed in the hot seat. International media outlets were questioning why the Ethiopian government would not accept external mediation. The Ethiopian government responded that this war was an internal affair, and it does not need international institutions to intervene in Ethiopia's sovereignty. But that was far from the truth. It was very clear that this war on Tigray was not an internal affair, as other countries were involved as well. This law and order operation included multiple actors that Abiy failed to mention: the Ethiopian Federal Army, neighboring country Eritrean Army, the Amhara military, which is a regional military, and also drones that was supplied by the UAE to bomb civilians. As well as Eritreans were, throughout this war, Eritrean soldiers were handing out Eritrean IDs in northern Tigray, like cities of like Adigrat, and then also in western Tigray, where it borders Amhara land, they were handing out Amhara IDs as well. So Abiy clearly used his alliance with dictator Isaias Afwerki. The peace deal that he made in 2018 came in hand now with him planning this whole war. It was clearly premeditated. And the truth of this genocide was really, truly beginning to unfold. And then next slide, please. And then on November 28, 2020, Abiy claimed that he captured the capital city of Tigray, which is Mekelle, and that the law and order operation was complete, and Ethiopians, as you can see, took the streets of Addis and were dancing and celebrating in joy. The people in Addis live in a very echo chamber, and they were basically fed that TPLF is gone, that they're dead, and that Miguel captured and everything's fine, but that was clearly far from the truth. Next slide, please. Although the Ethiopian government declared that victory, the genocide was, like I said, very far from over. Months continued, and Tigray continues to suffer immensely, including various war crimes that have been committed. Thousands of civilians have been killed by all of the invading forces. Estimated that 150,000 have been killed. The number is still, it continues to grow to this day. 2.5 million have been internally displaced. Ethnic profiling throughout Ethiopia. They've been weaponizing starvation as another form in this genocide. There's been an increase of sexual gender-based violence. Nearly 100,000 Eritrean refugees reside in Tigray, and their camps have been attacked, as well as the destruction of infrastructure, the destabilization of the healthcare system, and destroying of historical sites. And that's just to name a few of the atrocities that have taken place during these past 9 months. Next slide, please. So one of the main tactics that they've been using throughout this genocide is starvation. That's the easiest way to exterminate people, is to take away their food. And it's been used on the people of Tigray for decades. This is not the first time that the Ethiopian government, like mentioned, has attacked the people of Tigray, and this is the same tactic that they used in the past. In 1958, under the Haile Selassie regime, the famine claimed over 100,000 lives, and then again in the 80s, in 1984 and to 85, under the Mengistu's regime, 1.2 million were killed, and now in the present, 5.2 million people in Tigray, which is out of a population of 7 to 10 million, are in need of urgent humanitarian food aid. UN reports that 91% of Tigray is currently starving, and it's not because food is not there, it's because this food was taken away and is being weaponized. 33,000 children are at risk of dying, and 100 children die daily due to malnutrition. And this is all being done because from early on in this war, all the invading forces have looted food supply, they destroyed crops, stolen livestock, pretty much any form of way of people getting food, they've blocked it. So yeah, and humanitarian aid workers have also been attacked throughout this process. All invaders have made it their point to not allow the people of Tigray to eat, and just they're using food as like one of the main ways that they're exterminating the people of Tigray. Next slide, please. And then another method is sexual and gender-based violence has been on the rise throughout this whole conflict. It's estimated that at least 20,000, ranging up to 50,000 women and children have been raped by invading forces, ages ranging from as young as 4 to 89. They're also forcing other family members to rape other family members. They're gang raping these children and women by multiple forces. And just to name a few examples, there was one victim who was sexually assaulted with a metal rod and was told during the process that no Tigrayan should be born, that there shouldn't be a womb. There's another instance of a woman being raped, and as she was during the act, he's saying that he's harizing her, purifying her in a way. And most of these women have confessed that they have to be forced between rape or death, or exchange for basic commodities like food or water. A 25-year-old woman who was given, like I said, a choice between rape or death, he said, "I'll kill you or I'll rape you." So she didn't really have an option. In Shura, which is in northern Tigray, Eritrean soldiers raped and killed a 20-year-old autistic woman, killed her 14-year-old sister, and then raped their 60-year-old mother. When the mother asked them to kill her too, they responded, "No, we want you to cry." So it's clearly being used as a tactic. This war is heavily being fought on the bodies of women to destroy their psyche and to really inflict it onto the women and really like destroy their spirit. In this photo, this is Mona Lisa Abraha. She's 18 years old. She was in Tembin, Tigray, and air change soldiers were attempting to rape her, and she was fighting them off. And in result for giving them pushback, she was shot in her hand and arm, and she was bleeding out for several hours and resulted her arm to be amputated. So like I said, this is a war heavily being fought on women. They're clearly using this tactic to destroy the women and making the men powerless too. Like there's been instances where they'll force like the husband or the father to be on their knees as they perform the act on their wife or children. And Ethiopia's response has been rape is expected during war. So they've been complicit. They know that this is happening. It almost seems like this was an order from a lot of these military groups. So yeah, next slide, please. And then here is one of the victims of sexual slavery. So that's also another component where they'll kidnap women and children for several days and be repeatedly raped. Sennight was raped by 23 soldiers throughout this 10-day process. So it says Sennight grieves her 12-year-old son. She was drugged and tied to a tree and raped by air change soldiers for 10 days. At one point, she woke up to find her son dead at her feet, saying, "I never buried him." She screams between sobs, "I never buried him." So it's clearly rape is being used as a weapon of this war to destroy the psyche of women and to give them trauma for years to come. Next slide, please. Another component is the medical crisis. Currently, the healthcare system is completely collapsed in Tigray and destroyed. Only 82% of healthcare centers are not functioning, and only 2.5% of healthcare workers are currently working. Actually, the Eider Hospital, which is located in Mekelle, Tigray, the capital of Tigray, held like it was one of the most like highly awarded hospitals, and now that's like the healthcare system's completely destroyed. Physicians are obviously extremely overwhelmed by the lack of medication, vaccines, especially with the sexual gender-based violence victims. The vast majority of them are pregnant, and now it's 9 months, and a lot of them, there's hundreds of women and girls who are going to give birth around this time right now, since it's been 9 months since the start of the war. And they're also, along with the rape victims, a lot of times when they're raping them, they intentionally pass on sexual transmitted diseases, knowing that they have HIV and passing it on to them. So a lot of them have long-term illnesses now due to that. Also victims of malnutrition from starvation. And yeah, aid continues to be blocked by the Eritrean and Amhara and Ethiopian soldiers because everything has been looted. As you see, this is one healthcare facility that's been destroyed. They're intentionally destroying it. There's even a video of a healthcare facility destroyed, and on the wall it says "Game Over." So they're intentionally taking supplies, just mass destructing it so people don't get access to healthcare. And along with all the people who are starving currently and dying from malnutrition, people are dying from preventable deaths. For example, say if you're diabetic, now you don't have insulin, a lot of people are dying because of that. Just simple reasons that now people are dying because the healthcare system is completely collapsed. And also the facilities that are running, the very few, they're very monitored and by the troops, and they're really terrorizing the workers there. There's even been reports of certain hospitals where they kind of almost use it as a rape house. They'll come in from all forces and terrorize the patients, rape them in their own hospital bed, like they're already suffering, and then they attack them as well. So the healthcare system is completely collapsed, and they have a really hard time. International organizations, humanitarian organizations have an extremely hard time getting aid to Tigray due to the invading forces blocking the aid. Next slide. Okay. And then there are also these invading forces, like I said, the Eritrean forces, Ethiopian federal forces, Amhara forces. They're purposely targeting holy sites, and holy sites have become a home of massacres during this genocide. They'll attack on holidays and bomb, as you see here. These are photos of just a few that have been attacked. Eritrean troops bombed and looted the Cherkos Church in Zalambasa. They also bombed Deborah Damo Church in St. George Church in Tigray's capital, Mekelle City. And they've also bombed Aksum Church as well, Deon Mariam, which is considered home for the Ark of Covenant. Tigray is a very holy region. It's considered one of the birthplaces of Christianity as well. For Islam. Islam holds a great importance in the region as well. Prophet Muhammad seeks refuge in Tigray. The Al-Nagashi is the one that's with the blue top, the oldest mosque in Africa, and it's home in Tigray. And that was bombed as well in December by heavy artillery. So they're clearly attacking very prominent sites in Tigray. And especially they do this on holidays as well, when there's like mass gatherings. So they can target as many civilians. Like in the Aksum massacre, it's estimated that 800 people were shot dead that day. And they actually left, the Eritrean soldiers did not allow people to pick up the dead. They had them stay out there for 3 days. And if you attempted to pick up your loved one, they threatened that you would be killed as well. So it's really horrendous. Next slide, please. Okay, and then the destruction of economy. Within the all schools have been looted, as well as household properties, healthcare facilities, like I've said, have been looted, governmental properties, universities, and they're taking away like essential things like medicine, household items, clothing, vehicles, business properties, luxury goods. There's just been several, like a lot of factories have been destroyed, like the textile factory. There's countless, pretty much any form of something that would bring income to Tigray, they've destroyed or looted, or both. Eritrean forces have looted everything and anything from personal belongings to businesses and heavy machinery. Like I said, cars, ambulances, generators, literally everything has been looted and destroyed in Tigray. And actually, within the last few weeks, the unelected Prime Minister Abiy stated during a press release that their goal was to destroy Tigray's economy. Next slide, please. And then a more recent tactic that they've used is chemical warfare. So they've been dropping bombs or heavy artillery with this chemical. It's white phosphorus. This victim right here, she's 13 years old. She was a lucky survivor. Several were killed and injured. This is another child as well who was injured by or had a very deep chemical burns due to this chemical warfare. 42 tons of chemical weapons were also shipped to Tigray via Djibouti. And this is the same chemical that has been used in Syria, Vietnam, Palestine, all to attack civilians. So next slide, please. And then, like I said, another way to block aid and another method to ensure this genocide is the attack on humanitarian aid workers. If you threaten the humanitarian workers, it further implements this genocide. So Humanitarian workers have been a target since the start, and they instill fear. The IRC said that a member of their staff had been killed in Hinsan refugee camp in Shira on the 19th of November. So this has been starting from the beginning of the war. And this is 2 days before the government troops took control of the town. These three faces that you see right here is Johannes, Maria, and Tedros. These are 3 Doctors Without Borders who were killed recently and in Tigray. And just today, these photos were released. The photo below is the car on fire. So initially in the report, we weren't told when or how but we weren't told how they were killed. But obviously here you can see that their car was lit on fire. And unfortunately, due to this attack, because these organizations do have to protect their employees, they've suspended activities in Abiy Adi and Adigra and Aksum, but will continue in other areas of Tigray. So that further blocks humanitarian aid to Tigray. And then the photo right there you see is a plane that was just shot down, I believe the other day. It's the World Food Program plane, and it was going to deliver food to Tigray, and it has been shot down. So luckily everyone survived, but that's just another form that the Ethiopian government is blocking aid to Tigray. Next slide, please. And then, as well as I touched on earlier, Eritrean refugees, during the peace deal, there was a very short 6-month period where the borders of Tigray and Eritrea were open and you could drive back and forth. Thousands and thousands of Eritreans were fleeing from Eritrea and reside in Tigray. It's estimated that nearly 100,000 Eritreans do reside in Tigray, and currently 20,000 are missing. As you can see in the bottom photo, that's a satellite image of the camps being destroyed. So we don't know where those refugees went. There's reports saying that they were taken back to Eritrea, and some are at unknown locations. It's unclear what happened to these refugees. Next slide, please. And then this is a more recent massacre that happened, the Tonga massacre. On June 22nd, Ethiopian forces bombed Toga on Market Day. Like I said, they continue to, a lot of these massacres happen on either on apparent days where they know people will be there, like religious holidays, or on Market Day in urban areas. And this was on Market Day. 64 were killed, 180 were critically injured, and ambulances were blocked. So this is further instilling this genocide by blocking aid, because they're using every possible method to exterminate Tigrayans. And the ages affected ranged from 6 to 62 years old. And this is just one example of many massacres that have transpired the past 9 months. And honestly, there's many that we probably still don't know because of the multiple communication blockouts that have transpired in Tigray. Next slide. Okay. And I want to talk about Ethiopia's national elections that just recently happened in June. They postponed it several times due to COVID. That's how even this war, the preface of this genocide started. But it continuously was postponed, but it was recently held in June. However, Tigray was not on the ballot. Tigray did not get any representation in this vote. And there's also a lot of ethnic tensions that are currently happening. While Tigray is like the main fire right now in Ethiopia, there's fires throughout. There's border disputes and ethnic violence throughout Afar, Somalia, Oromia, Amhara, Bengal, Gumuz, just to name a few. So there's a lot of political tensions, and this elections was clearly not fair. And Abiy and his party, the Prosperity Party, made it clear to not allow any opposition parties to run, ensure that. And then COVID was the initial excuse for the postponed elections. but COVID has only risen from the start of this war, and the cases only continue to rise. So the cases before August 2020 were less than 20,000, and then now in March 2021, it's rising from 165,000 in the next week to 260,000 per week. So clearly COVID wasn't a legitimate reason for the postponed elections initially, and not one now. And also, like I said, there's very little voter representation. Only 25,251 polling stations out of the planned 50,000 were registered voters. So it was clearly not a fair election, and this was used for him to instill his place in power to commit what he's doing in Tigray, and also his goals of centralizing Ethiopia. Next slide, please. And this shows the Tigray Defense Force, which is the Tigrayan military. They, on June 28th, they regained the capital of Tigray, as well as several other cities. So in these photos, you can see the relief in people's faces, the joy. This was like the glimpse of light, the slight bit of protection that they've got to feel for over 8 months of this genocide. So it was a very big moment in this war, and just throughout this whole genocide in particular. This is the first time, like, they have their own people there. The Tigray Defense Force walked out thousands of Ethiopian soldiers, and they were all escorted out of Tigray. And then next slide, please. And then Ethiopian forces forced into an illegitimate ceasefire. And as you can see here, they destroyed the Tseki Bridge, which also blocked more humanitarian aid. That's the main access point to Western Tigray. Next slide, please. And then Ethiopia rejects the UN solutions, and the ethnic cleansing continues. I just wanted to read out what this letter that Abby stated. It had quite a bit of genocidal language, so I'll just read that out right now. And this was stated on July 18th, so extremely recent. This is the translation. "We are fighting against an enemy, which is Ethiopia's cancer," and he's referring to the people of Tigray. "The junta is perhaps the only group that has ever used earned political power to dismantle its own country. As the saying goes, the Satan that has lived with you would never be made to leave you alone easily. So the junta would continue to put up weak resilience left and right. Currently, the junta will be uprooted and never to grow again. This could only happen when all of us help in uprooting the invasive weed. Along the way, individuals making mistakes. We may hear divisive information. They may be argument even when our objective is the same. Nevertheless, we will achieve our objective. Ethiopian children from all corners have risen to the junta's plans. This itself is a victory. Ethiopian children have identified their enemy, and they know what to do, and they will do it. Those who are afraid of our unity will do everything to divide us. They will conspire to shift our focus from them onto our compatriots. We will never do it. Our current unity has broken junta's old treachery. Afterwards, it will break the source of the complaint, and finally, it will reform the victim of the complaint such treachery. Our divisive forces and our regional forces are properly positioning. They will provocation to hinder that. We will respond accordingly while still respecting the unilateral ceasefire. We will have a plan that answers that why, how, and where, and when to do something. The result will be soon by both friends and foes. If necessary, our army is prepared to carry out the impossible mission. We will work to uproot the weed. We will uproot the weed. We will be careful not to harm the wheat. In our country, farmers perform weed control by working in groups. That's what the Ethiopian children are doing. So this is the genocidal rhetoric that the Prime Minister is spewing to the people of Ethiopia, and it's clearly working. The people of Ethiopia have followed and showed extreme support. Please go to the next slide. Here you'll see the genocidal rhetoric that's coming with the people. So it's not just the political elites spewing this rhetoric, it's within the people as well. There's hate speech from Ethiopians and Eritreans throughout this whole war. As you can see, the photo she has a green flag right there. This is a screenshot from a video, but she said, "I want to cut Tigrayans with a knife." Ethiopians also took to the capital of Addis in a rally of support of the continuation of the war, saying, "Hands off Ethiopia," even with ridiculous rhetoric saying Ethiopia is #George Floyd. So clearly the people of Ethiopia are very brainwashed and considered very forward in their thinking. Next slide. I just wanted to make it very clear that Tigrayans are not safe in Ethiopia at all. It's been proven time and time again throughout history, like I stated, with all the man-made famines. And so long Ethiopia is, composed of independent nations, the struggle of power will always be there, and innocent civilians will continue to be attacked. Ethiopia has made it very clear that Tigrayans are welcome and they want us dead. They spew that into the rhetoric of Eritreans as well, and Ethiopians clearly follow. So yeah, next slide, please. So what can you do? How can you get involved? Currently, we've been having Twitter campaigns, so #TigrayGenocide has been our main hashtag, but there's several other ones like #TigrayCan'tWait. There's multiple Twitter campaigns that always go on, hosted by Omna Tigray. So that's like the leading organization on a global scale. They'll tell you everything you need to know about the war, how it started. They have situational reports, slide decks, petitions that you can sign. Gate Media, that's also a great source. It's an independent journalist who has been chronologically in the war. Health Professionals for Tigray Network is a coalition of Tigray professionals. They teamed up with different NGOs to provide life-saving aid to Tigray as we speak. Making Jeddah Not War is also a great organization where they sell t-shirts, totes, and all the proceeds go to Tigray. They partnered with NGOs as well. I believe it's based in Adigrat, Aksum, and one other city in Tigray, and are providing aid. Tigray Action Committee is also a great resource to keep up with. Next slide, please. And then what can you do locally? So the first thing is to follow STN. It'll be the best resource for locally. Our upcoming events, we have a national protest scheduled for August 20th. We're inviting everyone to come. It's going to be a huge festival held at, protest held at Westlake. Some other upcoming events that are a little sooner. We're going to have Tag Up the City, which is, we'll put flyers throughout the city on August 7th and the 14th. Also, King County Council member Girmay, who's also Tagaru, will have a roundtable Facebook Live, and then TPN, Tigray Professionals Network, has this Double Good popcorn virtual fundraiser that's going to start this following week. So there's definitely several ways you can get involved locally as well as like on a global scale. So yeah, next slide, please. And then if you guys have any questions, let us know. But yeah, that concludes our presentation. Let me know any questions that you guys have.
Thank you both so incredibly much for sharing your wisdom, your experiences, what's happening in Tigray and the people in Ethiopia. So much to process, and you both did such a good job like doing that in a really concise way. And I know talking about your national liberation struggle is not easy to do in an hour and a half, because it doesn't give it doesn't give like the right context, but you both did it really well, and I extend my deepest gratitude to you both. So right now, I think Mello is changing the slides again. We're going to take a short 5-minute break, and then we're going to have a Q&A section. So folks that put questions in the chat, we're going to give Rahel and Nadia a second to read those questions, and then we'll come back and they'll answer them. So go ahead and take 5 minutes, and Mello, play that music.
سبب ما سبيغا يوتكم هاجركا تدكم بركي تتم خبط عسكا تنتس برو تتغس عين مسافة تناي بينا أكبر إذا ما سن أكلكا ألا تزبلكا نخل بالحس جيركا أنا أزبقا سقانا يسدلقا متسال بشيتكا زندو نارخا زندو حرنكا منسي أتكخا مبري تقادلايز بمسمر حيلو تعي إدبخا تاكل سيوكا تقادلاي بمنتهي نجلسكا من تبزيني علي بمنتهي نجلسكا تبزيني علي مبري تقادلاي
All right. Just inviting everyone to come on back. If you are off screen, if you can hear me, please rejoin us. Loved the music. I'm glad that we went for the whole time. Really, really beautiful. I think somebody in our chat said there's a lot to sing about. So I love that sentiment. Yeah, I just want to thank y'all again for sharing with us. It is, I think I said it's both incredibly powerful and also deeply horrifying to hear. And I'm just so grateful that we have the opportunity to learn firsthand from y'all. Something that I was thinking about as y'all opened your presentation and you're kind of going back through the history is just how powerful it is to hear a history from the mouth of its people, especially living here in the imperial core, where so much of this stuff gets filtered through a white supremacist, imperialist, or colonialist lens. Yeah, the nuance, the complexity, the way that we combat, colonialism and imperialism's collapse of these complex histories and ethnic groups into a flat other is by hearing directly from the source. So just want to thank y'all for that. And another thing that I was thinking about was just, as you were deeper into the presentation, kind of talking about the genocide going on right now, is just the horror of it, and wondering how anyone can ever come back from that. And as you spoke, I saw the possibility in the future in the love and the anger and the resilience that y'all were speaking from. So yeah, I just want to thank you so much. We have a bunch of fantastic questions from the folks here tonight. Y'all are amazing with these. I wish we had time to answer every single one of them. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. So we're just going to open with the first question. What are some of the ways the people of Tigray and in Ethiopia and around the world have been fighting back in defense of their rights?
So in Tigray, the people are very powerless, so they really haven't gotten a chance to fight back. But I guess one of the ways is a lot of people are volunteering going into the military because they want to fight. They're saying, if I'm going to die, I'd rather die fighting for my people, fighting for our native land. So that's what people back home have been doing. Here, we've been all over social media, having Twitter campaigns, really just trying to get the word out there, going out of our comfort zone. Tagaro have really mobilized like crazy this past 9 months, obviously due to the circumstances, but yeah, they've been very united. So more of a social media presence in the diaspora, but definitely in Tigray, people are voluntarily joining the military and in defense for the people of Tigray.
Yeah, kind of going off what Rahel said, there was actually a video of a girl who ran away to the war initially and got sent back because she was too young. And so they told her, you're too young to be here. You can't fight with us. Once many of her friends actually got raped, she went back again and ran to the mountains to fight with them. And that point, they couldn't tell her no. They were like, we'll find something for you to do. So there's been, allegations of, child soldiers and such. And, but my 25-year-old cousin was murdered in front of his own home. So I look at it like I would have rather he went and fought in the mountains at least and defended his people than to just die in front of your house like you don't matter. So the local hospital spent 6 hours trying to save him, and he died in surgery. So, and that was in November. Now there are no surgeries going on now. There are no resources. So it's completely devastating what they're doing to the people. And so the response has been, well, if we have to fight for our lives, then we just have to do it. There's no other choice.
Wow, thank you both for sharing. As you both are talking and just sharing the vulnerability behind I'm just thinking about how grateful we are to have you both here today and just being able to share with us, and the strength it takes for such young folks to be able to run to the mountains to fight for their people, and the inherent feeling that they know they have to do that too. Mm-hmm. That's really powerful. There is another question.
I could just add one more thing. Sorry to interrupt. They're also in the news outlets, they're really marketing it, also with Ethiopian rhetoric, that these are rebels, like these are our family members. That's just one thing I wanted to add. They're really being told in Western media, even on like the front page of New York Times, that was like a big moment that we got front page, but they say the Tigrayan rebels. These are people fighting for their existence. So.
Yeah, and it goes to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that's a great point. It's a great.
Yeah, and it goes to show like the power of imperialism, right? That they control the media and what it's actually being put out there. And I know you both were saying that there was a media blackout. Like nobody had access to electronics. Nobody had, I mean, they barely have access to anything. So yeah, these experiences that you're telling us is so important for us to hear, because it's a non-traditional way of keeping every story of and every Tigrayan person's story alive. Okay, is it okay if I move on to the next question?
Yeah, next question.
Awesome. So what is the status of the liberation fronts today? Are there any fronts that still uphold a Marxist/Leninist ideological line?
So I have this theory that there was this colonialism was kind of ending in a lot of Africa. So I have this theory, there was during the era of the Cold War, really, that's sort of when all of these views came about, right? So even though TPLF initially had these Marxist Leninist views, so did the Derg regime, and they killed 2 million people. So it's kind of interesting to see where those viewpoints stuck and where they kind of abandoned them and shifted towards the United States version of imperialism, if that makes sense. Because there was kind of like this shift from colonialism to like, well, now we have to do what the World Bank says and the United States and all these different international organizations. So I don't think that there is much of a Marxist Leninist movement in Ethiopia, but I can't really speak to that today. What I can speak to is like the Oromo Liberation Front. And I know that came out of rebellion for rebellion against the empire. So I'm not sure exactly what viewpoints they hold, but that's been a front in Ethiopia that's been there for at least 50 years. They were there for almost every other regime, as well as when Tigrayans held power. And then there's a lot of different liberation fronts still, but as far as what their beliefs are, I think most of them are at a point where they're just anti-Ethiopia, and they use that sort of colonial narrative to go against Ethiopia.
Thank you. I'm just noting in the chat, I really appreciate, like Fran was mentioning a lot of parallels, and something that this was just making me, or reminding me a lot of, is partition in India. I think like it's just, seeing the ways that, when colonial forces draw out and the people who remain kind of have to deal with the narratives and with the ways they've adapted to those narratives and used those narratives to harm their own people. The way that just shatters nations, shatters people, and has very long-term impacts. So thank you. All right, so the next question that we have here is, are there groups calling for the dissolution of the Ethiopian state to support regional sovereignty? And then what do y'all, the two of you and the Seattle Tigray Network, see as long-term solutions, or more generally, what do you hope for in the region?
So I think when it comes to people in the diaspora, we generally hold the belief that we want Tigrayans to be able Tigrayans who live in Tigray to be able to speak for themselves. And if they want sovereignty and if they want freedom, they need to have that at the ballot box. And I think that is also, the TPF leaders who are now the TDF forces, they also agree that if the Tigrayan people want liberation, that they will fight for it. I don't think that they themselves still, the leadership that is, I believe, still supports Ethiopia, still wouldn't mind staying within the Ethiopian construct. When I hear them talk, they repeatedly say, well, we need to hear from the people of Tigray before we make a decision like that. We cannot call for sovereignty, or, I mean, they call for sovereignty, but to call for freedom and liberation, they say we need to make sure that the people of Tigray even have that opportunity. And they don't have that opportunity currently because they don't have resources. They're dying in the thousands. So until any of that is resolved, they're saying we can't necessarily even have a conversation like that. However, they still firmly stand for the sovereignty that they are earned in their constitution, and they support the ballot box, if that makes sense. They want people to decide for themselves their own future, not necessarily people in the diaspora or people who don't actually live in Tigray.
Thank you.
And just to add on to that, there's been other groups that have supported the sovereignty of Tigray and calling for an end for this genocide. Recently, the Union of Oromo Communities in Canada came out with a statement on July 19th condemning what's going on in Tigray, saying that they denounced the deployment of Oromia regional forces into Tigray. So like I said in the presentation, Abiy's continuing this war. Like, it's not coming to an end. This genocide is not ending. He's deploying more soldiers and from all across Ethiopia. So Oromos in Canada have denounced that. Also, throughout our movement, we've had support from YAKO, which is opposition to Eritrea's government. Those have been like the main people bordering, like from Ethiopia / Eritrea, who've been denouncing what's going on.
Thank you. Sorry, my screen got messed up. Thank you for sharing that. Those are really important points to keep as we continue moving on. Hold on one more second. There we go. So our next question asks, it sounds like different ethnic groups lead their own movements and liberation struggles. What does solidarity look like between these different groups? What are challenges, and do they fight against the same enemy?
So like I said, there's been some solidarity with Oromos and Eritreans who are opposition to the Eritrean government. But I don't know if we're necessarily fighting the same enemy. There's been some struggles because of also like the past lies that have been told. Like, for example, the border war between Eritrea and Ethiopia gave really bad history between Eritreans and Tagaru, meaning that like someone can be opposition to the Eritrean government, but they still have a lot of resentment towards the people of Tigray. So there's been some struggles there. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Yeah, what does solidarity look like between those different groups? What are the challenges, and do they fight against the same enemy?
I feel like the solidarity has shown in protests. Like, we've had joint protests, definitely in Seattle and also nationwide. There's been joint protests, so there's been in-person solidarity, also on social media with Twitter campaigns and just different online campaigns as well. I guess the same enemy, I don't know if Nadia, you want to chime in on this part. I think the same enemy is that we all believe our right to self-determination. Each group, because in Eritrea, it's a very repressive regime. Their people don't have any form of self-determination. Oromos don't have as well. And obviously the people of Tigray are being currently are under genocide. So I think that's the common thread where we come together and unite, is the fight for self-determination.
I think you said that really well, Rahel. I think that's exactly true. It is the fight for self-determination that unites us. However, it's self-determination from each other. At times, it's this group over that group and that group over this group, which is something that we've seen European colonizers do to people, right? With Rwanda, they put the Tutsis in a position, I believe it was Tutsis, they put the Tutsis in a position to hold power over the Hutus, which then sort of fueled this hatred of the Tutsis by the Hutus. So what's happening in Ethiopia is really the different groups like struggling with each other. So there are people who, will say, I'm fighting for liberation against Ethiopia, but who claims Ethiopia at the end of the day if none of us want to be Ethiopian, right? There really is just sort of one group that still holds the belief that they are Ethiopian and they believe in the unity of Ethiopia. So if we do have one enemy, and I don't want to paint an ethnic group as an enemy, because we know that within an ethnic group, they all have different viewpoints and they all have different beliefs. But the regional government of Amhara is really pushing this narrative that Tigrayans are the enemies, that Oromos are savages, and we are the elite in Ethiopia, and we are the only ones who have the power, and we should have the power because we're so much smarter and greater than quote unquote everybody else. So if there is an enemy, it would probably be the Amhara regional government and the greater Ethiopian construct.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Just so many thoughts. I think something that is really striking me, especially as you're, when you were, there's been several comparisons to similar situations in other countries, and what's really striking me is, these colonial powers from this imperial core come in, set up situations that shatter countries, that pit ethnicities against each other, and then are able to step back now and say like, oh, we're this force spreading peace and justice throughout the world, and you are just backward, you can't get it together, you continually fight and perpetuate this narrative that that these problems like originate with these people, and it's just something inherent to who they are. So I appreciate the struggles and the context that you're giving us. All right, so the next question that we have, okay, so we're bringing it back to imperialist powers. We've been talking, everything is about imperialist powers, but can you address the ties between the Ethiopian government and the US or other kind of global imperialist powers?
Yes.
Sorry. There's a follow-up question.
I got way too excited.
There's a follow-up question. I'm just going to read it now, but I'm going to repeat it once you're done. But what is your organization's response to the possibility of US intervention and the role of AFRICOM and US interests in the region? So first question.
Well, I would say first off, we don't want any United States intervention in Ethiopia. We don't want their boots on our grounds. We don't want their soldiers in our streets. We don't want any more soldiers in our streets than there currently already is. The problem in Tigray is there are, the Eritrean soldiers, the Amhara soldiers, the Ethiopian soldiers. There's reports that Somalia has soldiers there. So it's just too many. They all got to go. It's an invasion type of situation. So we definitely don't support US intervention on the ground. We do. So the thing is, the Ethiopian government has a right-wing authoritative regime, which was backed by the Republican administration. So Donald Trump did support Ethiopia. The Biden administration has taken a different stance. They there's actually a House bill right now that is about to be passed. Or they're going to vote on it pretty soon, that we want to agitate with all of our legislators, make sure that they vote on it. And I believe Gurmai's event later, I think it's next week, will highlight that even more. And we'll talk about that more in detail since he is talking with US representatives. But the Biden administration is a little bit more open to the atrocities that are happening in Tigray. They have not taken any firm stances, and they haven't done much beyond condemnation. We condemn the attack. So they haven't really done anything really. And ironically, there has been support from different senators. I know when we were going to sell the UAE some more drones, and we knew that the drones were being supplied by the UAE to Ethiopia. And so Senator Rand Paul actually stopped the sale of drones to the UAE. So strange bedfellows, never ever thought that he'd be on my side, but I'll take the support wherever it comes at the end of the day. So he was able to prevent the sale of more drones to them, which I think did prevent even more drone bombings from happening. A lot of the initial buildings being destroyed were at the beginning of this war, and I haven't seen that as much anymore. So I don't know if but they did switch to phosphorus gas, which we believe they got from Russia. So, they kind of moved from one US, superpower to the other superpower, getting weapons from this one, getting weapons from that one. So it hasn't really made much of there hasn't really been too much benefit. We do have to continue to agitate with those legislators to pass the bill, but I believe it's also just condemning the atrocities. I don't know that it's taking a hard stance against, Ethiopian Airlines facilitating anything or stuff like that.
Well, thank you so much. It seems like you definitely answered the second question there, so I'll go ahead and pass it back to Rana.
Yeah, thank you. Also, I'm still shocked at Rand Paul because that's kind of comical.
It was. I was like, yeah. was different. It was different. But they, they're against US intervention. Libertarians are, for the most part. They don't want the United States being involved in wars around the world. So there are certain things we agree on.
Yeah, I wish they could draw those same, parallels and intersections to other places around the world, Palestine.
Absolutely.
But, that's just their blind spot, their immense blind spot. Let's see here. So it's 7:55. I want to ask, let's try and get a couple more questions in. Last question. Okay. What role does anti-imperialist alliance play? Oh, sorry. What role does an anti-imperialist alliance play in the victory of your movement? How can we coordinate multilateral efforts that target shared enemies? I'm sorry, it's been a long.
So for me, I think that anti-imperialism really means, in our struggle, really means truly being Pan-African, right? And going against the imperial African nations that act and use the same tactics as other colonial states like Israel and North Korea and the United States, right? Eritrea itself uses conscripted military, just like Israel. So there's a lot of similarities between how these nations rule and how other colonial nation states rule. So for me, I think it means truly having a Pan-African ideal in the sense that we truly are supporting the nation states that existed before the lines were drawn all over Africa. And so materially, really, it means preventing the United States from selling even more weapons to UAE. It means going against narratives that aren't truly for us. I think we saw with everyone shared that post about Cuba, and it was really advocating for US intervention in Cuba. And so I think that same thing keeps happening with Ethiopia, where there's this narrative of a Pan-African struggle, and we need to have unity in Ethiopia amongst all the groups, but we really have to work hard to go against that narrative, because that narrative is the colonial narrative that's hurting us. There is no one Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a colonized settler state, and we need to start labeling it as such. I think really victory for us isn't necessarily our sovereignty right now. It's prevention of 1.5 million displaced people from being murdered. It's saving a small ethnic group of 6 to 10 million people. I mean, Stalin killed 33 million people. Leopold killed like 40 million people. I think it's very easy for a nation to get away with doing something like this. And so for us, it's really about educating people, letting them know that we exist, we're here, that Tigray has a long history, and that we're fighting for our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to piggyback off of that, this has been repeating, like within my own grandmother's generation. She's been in war 3 times. There's even refugees, people who fled to Sudan who fled in the 80s, and they had to do it again now. So this is repeating like every 30 years. So that's the biggest thing, is that it continues. This is not the first time, and they've done it, and they're clearly using any type of method to exterminate Tigray. Like there's reports saying like we just have to accept that thousands of children are gonna die now because just due to starvation. Like, and Tigray was thriving. Like I was there in 2019 on vacation to see family. It was very thriving. Diaspora built up Tigray, not Ethiopia. By raising money with everything, like through TDA, which is Tigray Development Association. Diaspora has emptied their pockets for Tigray, and yeah, it's just been completely destroyed now. But yeah, that's what I was trying to say. I lost my train of thought.
Oh, that's really great. I just want to uplift something that Carly wrote in they wrote a quote: "Anti-imperialism is in our struggle means being Pan-African and going against imperial African nations, in the sense that we are truly supporting the nation states that existed before the lines were drawn all over Africa." And yes, that comes from Nadia. That's really no, but that's like a really good encompassment of like what you all have been saying today. Yeah, in Arabic, we have this quote that says, revolution until victory. And I truly feel that the Tigrayan people are an embodiment of that. Thank you so much. So that kind of
absolutely. To piggyback off that, the Tigray people actually use the word Wayane a lot, and Wayane actually means revolution. And so it's embedded in us. You know, we always tell people like Wayane is in our blood. So it's very similar.
Thank you. Mello, can you go to the next slide? Awesome. So that concludes our Q&A session. Thank you again, Rahel and Nadia, for the most amazing, informative session that y'all could pack in an hour and 30 minutes. I have a lot to chew on and a lot more research to do myself, and I hope that all the comrades on this call continue to dig deep and don't let this be the last stop. So yes, sorry, I was reading something in the chat. So yeah, and there's another upcoming future session for the National Liberation Series. This is not over. There's a future session on August 24th. This is part 3 from 6 to 8 p.m. Also, if you are a part of a national liberation struggle and wish to highlight your national liberation struggle, you can always email ILPS or message them or DM them on Instagram. We love to hear about the cross intersections between liberation struggles, because that's what makes us stronger. Next slide, please.
Thank you. Just so for upcoming events and community events that ILPS is supporting and other things, we have PSONA coming up on July 31st this weekend. Super exciting. So if you don't know, PSONA is the People's State of the Nation. This is an event that is put on by the various orgs in the Bayan Alliance supporting national democracy in the Philippines every year. The Duterte administration, President Duterte, gives a People's State of the Nation that only serves to prop up the continued atrocities happening in the Philippines, the corruption, the unjust killings that continue. So the people of the Philippines put on their own State of the Nation, and we have one happening right here in Seattle. It's going to be a great time. It is going to be a kid and family friendly event. There will still be clear, spicy, radical messaging. So definitely invite everybody to come out and support. And I think there's some more information about that on the slide where it is, because I forget off the top of my head, Jefferson Park. But with that, we'll just move on to the next slide. Thank you, Othello Park. Thank you so much. I'm sorry if I confused anybody. Oh, and thank you. I think Henry in the chat was asking about the dates of the event that y'all mentioned with Gurmai and the National Day for Tigray. So if anyone is able to put that information, I think y'all also said if we follow you on at Seattle Tigray Network, we'll also be able to see that information there. So encourage folks to look that up. Hopefully we can turn out a strong contingent. And then finally, we're just going to close with a chant together. So if you're unfamiliar, in a moment, I'm going to ask y'all to go off of mute, and we're going to say I am going to say long live, and you're going to answer international solidarity. And we're going to do that twice. So as awkward as Zoom chants are, I think we can do it, y'all. Let's hear those voices coming out strong. I invite folks to come off of video if you are comfortable with that, and come off of mute. And I'm going to say, long live
international solidarity.
Long live
international solidarity.
All right, y'all, we did it. Next slide, please. Just to close, definitely recommend that y'all check out the various organizations linked here for the social media sites. Thank you so much to whoever rounded all of these up. To folks who are new to ILPS or new to any of these struggles or any of the orgs mentioned today, definitely invite you to reach out, get involved. Every single new person is another breath of air to the movement, as I know folks within Bayan love to say. And we really, truly are all stronger together. So one more big, huge thank you to to Nadia, to Rahel for joining us today, sharing your struggle. It was so powerful to hear. And thank you, everyone. See you on August 24th.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Nadia.